Welcome back, everyone. In this session, we're shifting the spotlight from federal regulation to the rapidly evolving state level landscape, where policy meets practice in classrooms, district offices, and state education departments. While federal law sets the baseline for accessibility, many states are taking proactive steps, introducing their own mandates, offering funding support, and reshaping procurement practices. These moves aren't just legal updates, they're shaping how EdTech providers build products and how institutions make purchasing decisions. I'm joined once again by Ken Nakada, whose legal expertise and public entities and vendors bring depth and clarity to today's conversation.
Oh, thanks, Mladen. Good to see you again.
So, Ken, let's get started. What is going on at the state level?
Oh, there are a number of things going on at the state level. I think in large part it's in order to help the states prepare for the new DOJ regulations, but also because states are recognizing that digital accessibility is really important for their residents with disabilities. And this also is being seen in EdTech and in public schools, but also just in general within states for cities and counties in order to help meet the new Title II regulations. So states are doing things like they're encouraging organizations to get accessibility status reports or developing plans for accessibility, including timelines for how they're going to achieve digital accessibility. They're also encouraging them to do things like collect accessibility conformance reports and VPATs and things like encouraging vendors, encouraging state, local governments, including schools, to have their vendors provide live accessibility demos as part of model procurement policies that incorporate accessibility. I think that a lot of that is also geared towards trying to help them share resources so that that way they can lower their overall costs. In terms of actual specific legislation, there's also been some movement on that front as well. So, for instance, New Jersey created a new legislation that required that all state agencies meet WCAG 2.1A and AA, and that they created a certification process for state agency websites. But I think the real big mover is Colorado, both in terms of what they're doing with state agencies and local entities, and also what they're requiring for public education.
So, Ken, it sounds like that states are helping districts and universities prepare for this accessibility compliance mandate, and they're doing that by continuing to expand some of their existing legislation. Ken, you mentioned the state of Colorado as an example to watch. Can you say more about what's going on there?
Well, the big thing that everybody's been focusing on in Colorado is their House Bill 211110. And that's a law that's unlike any law in the country, and it requires all Colorado public entities. So this includes all city governments, all county governments, all state government agencies, all public schools, school districts, public universities, everybody that's a public entity within the state of Colorado to meet WCAG 2.1A and AA. And if they don't do it, then they can be held liable for damages of $3,500 per violation. So it really is a sweeping law. And after 211110 was passed, Colorado also passed another law, which was House Bill 251152. That's specific to public schools or public universities and public colleges, any public educational entity. And it's a little bit different because it makes it easier for public universities and public schools to meet the earlier law 211110 because what it does is it builds into every contract that a university, school district, anything public education has with their edtech vendors. It builds into those contracts an indemnification clause. So even if the university or school district doesn't say in their contract that the vendor has to indemnify them for any losses that they suffer, they it's built in anyways, and you can't get around it. It's part of Colorado state law. So an indemnification clause basically means that if the school gets sued and has to pay any money damages, that it's the vendor who has to pay the school to cover those damages. So, 211110 only technically applies to the university or the public school, not to the vendor. 1152 turns that around and says, oh, and if the school does have to pay any damages, it's the vendor who has to reimburse the school or indemnify the school, in other words, for those losses. So it really is a major mover for EdTech vendors.
Ken, thank you for sharing that insight with us. What this means for EdTech vendors is that they will need to be really careful in Colorado in order to avoid statutory damages that could add up very quickly. Ken, how are state efforts starting to impact the RFP process EdTech vendors need to follow?
Well, that's a great question, Walad. A lot of states have required that their vendors provide things like ACRs and VPATs in the RFP process, but until now, there hasn't been much to back that up. Some universities, for instance, just have policies that technology had to be accessible, and because there wasn't any law backing those things up, a lot of it became loosey-goosey. A lot of vendors could just pay lip service to the idea of accessibility, and they could get by in the procurement process. But now that public schools have something that they can actually point to and say, this is a legal requirement that we've got to meet, they're getting a lot stricter in those requirements. So the language might not have changed all that much in the contracts and in the RFPs, but the seriousness with which the universities or schools are taking this is much, much higher now because of the ADA Title II reg and also because of laws like Colorado's HB 211110 if you happen to be in Colorado. So what that means is that public entities are looking to vendors to be more serious and to provide things like serious manual testing results, but provided by somebody who actually knows how to test with assistive technology. They're not just going to take a simple VPAT that's filled out by somebody who doesn't know anything about accessibility anymore. They're also going to be doing things like asking the vendors to give live demonstrations using assistive technology of their products. And they're also going to be doing things like when they see a accessibility report, they want to see that it was actually conducted by a third party company that knows accessibility. So, yeah, they're taking it a lot more seriously. Another thing that we've seen is that sometimes they'll even hold up contracts until a vendor can demonstrate that their product actually is accessible. So, yeah, it's being taken a lot more seriously. One of the interesting things in terms of like what states are doing informally, sort of behind the scenes, is we're seeing a lot of school districts, a lot of public universities, particularly K through 12 school districts, doing things like comparing notes about which products they think are more accessible than others. And some of them are going so far as to start actually creating databases. And one of the things that's, I think, really relevant for EdTech vendors in that context is that you don't want to be recorded in a database as a company that doesn't take accessibility seriously because that's going to stick with you. And so I could very easily see that some vendors end up becoming persona non grata in terms of their potential customers because they get recorded in a database as being a vendor that doesn't have very accessible products. It's kind of like the same thing if being an Uber driver doesn't have a perfect 5-star rating. If you get recorded in one of these informal databases as a vendor who doesn't make accessible products, well, only thing that means is if you're going to lose out on a lot of opportunities to vendors who do have more accessible products or that have higher ratings.
Yes, it sounds like that accessibility is really becoming a key funding gate on top of being a legal criteria for purchasing decisions. As you helped us learn in the federal level, webcast institutions are themselves liable for compliance with ADA. Ken, what is going on in terms of monitoring and enforcement practices at the state level?
Well, quite frankly, Milad, not very much. At the state level, there's a lot of information out there. The states are more than happy to provide implementation support in terms of best practices and sharing of resources and things like that. But in terms of actively monitoring and enforcement, not terribly much. In terms of monitoring, some states do require state agencies to submit annual reports on their accessibility efforts. But even there, they don't do much follow up. For enforcement, we were not seeing much at all. It is possible that the state attorney generals could be enforcing either state law, like in the case of Colorado HB 211110, or sometimes even federal law. So, for instance, the New York attorney general sometimes gets involved in ADA cases on behalf of New York residents. But I don't see that very much happening at the state level in terms of enforcement. Really, I think the bigger sledgehammer in terms of enforcement is the federal government and private lawsuits. So we are going to be seeing private lawsuits under ADA Title II for web accessibility, and we are going to be seeing OCR actions that result from that. And OCR already has hundreds of them in backlog. So eventually, those actions are definitely going to come to fruition.
Thank you, Ken, for that clarification. And it sounds like that OCR is going to remain the primary enforcement agency for web accessibility and education, but it's a good idea and good practice to follow what is going on at the state level, case in point being Colorado. So, Ken, last question for this episode is, what are the key state level risks EdTech organizations need to be aware of?
Well, the first one is the big risk that we've all been talking about repeatedly today, and that's what's going to happen in the procurement process. So, if you don't take accessibility seriously, the big risk is you're just going to lose a contract, or you're going to end up getting disqualified because your product isn't accessible, or you may end up getting displaced by somebody who does. So, that's the obvious big risk, and I think it's an existential threat for any organization that relies largely on selling to state level entities. There's also a secondary risk, though. It's a little bit more subtle, and I think we've also hinted at this, and that's loss of goodwill. If you have inaccessible products, word gets around. Ultimately, what that means is that very subtly, you're going to end up losing a lot of your customer base to your competitors. That gets around in another way. If one of your customers ends up with an OCR complaint, those matters are a matter of public record. So if your product was the reason that a school or a university or a school district ended up getting sued or investigated by OCR, that word gets around, and it's a pretty hard to shake that off. And when that happens, every school district in the country or every university in the country is going to know about it. Now, then that could be, if that happens, yeah, then that can really devastate an ed tech vendor. Then there's also the more direct potential liability. We've talked about Colorado's HB 211110 and HB 251152 that requires indemnification. That's direct money damages that an ed tech vendor potentially is going to have to pay to a public school. Uh, then there's also other financial damages, like in New York, for instance. There are also statutory damages there. And then there's also, again, the possibility of indemnification, although the requirement for indemnification is a lot harder in New York because you don't have that statute to back it up with. So, yeah, there's a number of significant risks now at the state level because of these legislations for edtech vendors.
Thank you, Ken. So sounds that accessibility, compliance, and proactive approach is going to be a critical criteria for winning contracts, for keeping contracts, and doing all that by staying in black and not losing money. So let's recap this session on state level legislation and enablement. Sounds like many states have additional laws that generally reinforce federal requirement and account for specific needs and challenges that they see at the state level. I think the best news for me continues being that they are all consistently pointing to RECAC 2.1 AA as a standard. And as we mentioned earlier, that is going to be important for EdTech vendors as it will enable us all to manage business risk.
Yeah, I think that it's important to remember that there is a lot going on at the state level in order to help meet the WCAG requirements, whether it comes from Colorado's law, if you happen to be in Colorado, or selling to Colorado, or you're trying to meet the federal requirements that we talked about in the last episode. It's important to remember that there's a lot of things that state entities are doing to require that their vendors meet these requirements. And so you're going to see a lot of things in RFPs. You're going to see a lot more data sharing, a lot more requirements for vendor demonstrations, a lot more seriousness when it comes to looking at accessibility reporting. It's becoming a fundamental business requirement for a lot of these organizations. And so they're going to be looking at it just like they look at security or just like they look at privacy. They're taking it a lot more seriously.
Yeah, that's a clear takeaway. And it also sounds that Colorado is a leading example of comprehensive approach at the state level. I'm glad we covered that into more details. EdTech companies that do well in Colorado should be in a good shape to do well nationwide.
I would agree with that.
I think state enforcement mechanisms seem to be still developing and growing. So for the time being, we need to think of OCR as the main enforcement agency. And I think we also emphasize that there are a number of key risks for EdTech vendors, starting with losing specific RFP to losing the goodwill and reputation in the market. And obviously, those have significant impact on their future sales. And I think one thing at the end is also probably worth mentioning is that at the end of the day, from EdTech vendor perspective, the speed in which we're able to close any accessibility gaps, whether known or unknown, is going to be an essential factor for mitigating business and legal risks for EdTech organizations in the future.
Yeah. I think it's also important to remember that Colorado is just one state in this country. It's a big, important market for any vendor, of course, but they're just the beginning. What happens in a lot of disability rights legislation is that something starts at the federal level, and then there's always follow-on legislation at the state level. Take 508, for instance, that requires that technology be accessible when you procure it. Well, when you develop, procure, maintain, or use it is the full language, but it's really a procurement law. A lot of states have adopted 508. In fact, most of them have, either in their procurement practices or as part of their state law. Now that we've got this Department of Justice regulation that requires WCAG compliance, what's going to happen is that over the next 5 years, we're going to see a ton of states doing exactly the same thing. So this discussion that we've been having about state governments is just beginning.
Ken, thank you for unpacking the powerful and sometimes complex developments at the state level. This was very educational and informative. Across these two sessions, federal and now state, we've seen that the direction is consistent. Digital accessibility in education is no longer optional. Compliance is becoming a strategic and operational imperative for EdTech organizations. One of the most encouraging takeaways is the growing alignment around RECAG 2.1 AA as the shared standard. This makes it possible for institutions and EdTech companies to plan and scale solutions more effectively across the board. The company's success will hinge on showing up to the RFP process well prepared, continuing to be a transparent, trusted partner for institutions, and helping them meet their obligations under federal and state laws. Beyond compliance, this is also a moment for leadership. If we get this right, we can close a long-standing access gaps for nearly 8 million K-12 students and many more in higher education and our workforce. The final part of our legal landscape mini-series will address additional questions received from EdTech leaders. If you haven't submitted yours yet, head to the Accessibility Landscape homepage shown here and send them in. Until then, let's keep building accessible educational experiences that will benefit everyone across America.